All right, so let me start. Welcome to the second CAU Center for Cinema and Media Studies Colloquium today. And my name is Jiun Kim, professor and the director of the center. And today we're gonna have um, so we are very happy to have the Rick Warner as today's speaker. So I'm gonna give you my introduction of him. And all right, so the Dr. Warner is a Bowman and Golden Gray Distinguished Term Professor now in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at University of North Carolina at Chapter Hill. And his research interests include film aesthetics, film history, especially European, North American, and East Asian film theory and philosophy, documentary and essay film, and experimental avant-garde cinema, genre studies, performance studies, and media studies. His first book is Godard and the Essay Film, A Form That Thinks, published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. And he has published, very interesting and rich articles in, in important journals such as the Critical Quarterly, Studies in World Cinema, and Quarterly Review of Film Video, and others, as well as in a number of anthologies. Today's topic the topic of today's talk, dark cinema's anxious atmospheres for an expanded theory of cinematic suspense, is based on his latest book, The Rebirth of Suspense, Thronics and Atmosphere in Cinema, published by Columbia University Press last year. So please welcome Dr. Rick Warner for today's talk.
Thank you, Jahoon. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm very grateful to have been invited to participate in this colloquium and happy to be joining you all. It's the evening for me. I know it's the morning for those of you in Seoul. So as Jahoon pointed out, the talk that I'm giving tonight, or this morning for you, it is basically a distillation of what this book is about. So I'm trying to put several of my fundamental ideas and arguments into this talk. I'll be referencing a lot of different films and examples along the way. And I'm going to build toward a consideration of Albert Serra's film Pacifiction, which actually doesn't feature in this book as a case study. So that's new material that I'm bringing into play here. But I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts when we get to the Q&A. Okay. In the past decade, film theory has taken a vibrant turn to atmosphere as part of a bid to examine more robustly the environmental and sensorial dimensions of cinema. In these revised accounts, to highlight a film's atmosphere is to describe less a scenic backdrop for narrative events than cinema's power to spatialize feelings through an array of sonic and visual devices that texture the film's world. This line of inquiry explores how a film distributes its affectively charged atmospheres not just on the screen, in a fictional universe removed from us, but also through the very environment of our encounter. It seeks to explain how cinema's multi-sensory atmospheres, before and beyond their service to the plot, surround, permeate, and influence the observer's bodily felt experience. This turn to atmosphere can also be called a return, insofar as the thinkers in question have revisited ideas that were advanced much earlier by classical theorists. Antonio Somaini has shown how Walter Benjamin's definition of medium in German extends beyond the commonplace account of medium in English as a technical instrument by encompassing an arena of perception, a milieu, or, quote, field in which sensory experience takes place, unquote. In a similar vein, Stefan Wien has reconceived the film diegesis in environmental terms. What is diegetic isn't just a textual domain of plot action, but also a spatially resonant atmospheric world with which an embodied spectator has immersive, pre-reflective contact. For this idea of cinema, Wien finds earlier traces in classical theorists such as Jean Epstein, Louis Deluc, and Sergei Eisenstein, the French filmology movement, the film philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, and certain phenomenological approaches. Other key contributions in this area are Daniel Yakovone's theory of film worlds, in particular what he calls cineaesthetic world feeling, and Inga Pullman's and Robert Sinnerbrink's respective accounts of Stimmung, a German term and concept that translates all at once as atmosphere, mood, and attunement. In the light of this renewed research into questions of atmosphere, it soon becomes clear that certain film styles, emotions, and spectator investments need to be reappraised. In what follows, I want to show how suspense is one such practice and experiential dynamic that has suffered from a lack of atmospherically minded attention in film scholarship. While suspense is widely considered to rely upon moody and atmospheric operations, received understandings of suspense in film studies tend to downgrade and omit atmosphere, whether the films themselves enact this relegation or not. Suspense tends to be explained in strictly narrative terms that concern the viewer's psychological accord with characters in peril. Entrenched theories, most of which are cognitive in orientation, pivot on epistemic questions of a point of view and plot as the spectator weighs different possible outcomes, hoping for the best or the most morally correct result, but fearing the worst. And that's Noel Carroll's approach to suspense in particular. Yet, this explanation ignores the crucial fact that when we are in suspense, we feel a sensorial and somatic attachment not merely to characters in the fiction, but to the film's world more generally, and to the very operations of style that impart that world and render it emanative. Indeed, what secures this bond is not just our knowledge-based investment in a plot, but our bodily felt anxiety as it is provoked by the sensuousness of sonic and visual cinematic forms. Suspense comes with spatiotemporal and perceptual factors that make it an environmental affair. With a view to giving a more thorough account, I will sketch a definition of suspense as it functions chiefly, not to say exclusively, in an atmospheric register. To this end, I will turn to what might seem an unbefitting source, an art house tendency that, for better or worse, goes by the name slow cinema. So the films that you see here are the main case studies that figure in my book. And the ones outlined in purple are the films that I would consider, those are squarely within the category of slow cinema as it tends to be understood. And the films that aren't outlined in purple are at least, bordering on that category. Critical approaches to slow cinema have tended to assign a single aesthetic paradigm to all or most instances, be it one of boredom or wonder. Depending on the commentator, slowness may either enlist boredom as a strategy of resistance against the fast speeds of popular cinema and global capitalism, or it may offer a pensive space for calming the nerves, as Lutz Kopnick puts it. Other scholars have shown how this sort of filmmaking caters to a drowsy or even an intermittently sleeping spectator. In contrast, however, I wish to explore how slowness in art films may induce the uncertainties and anxieties of suspense, what I will call atmospheric suspense. Although it is nothing new to claim a profound atmospheric vocation for slow films such as Bela C'est un Tango and Carlos Regattas' Silent Light, critics frequently neglect or at least de-emphasize the uneasy affects that may accompany slowness. If suspense is invoked at all in these discussions, it is usually in the negative, as something a slow style necessarily rejects. To dispute this outlook, I will provide an uncommonly broad morphology of suspense, and then I'll take up Albert Serra's Pacifiction, an art house political thriller of sorts, as my main point of evidence, with other contemporary slow films drawn in for comparison. By observing how suspense of an atmospheric order can be enhanced by unhurried rhythms and dialed back dramatic intensities, we will discover that slow cinema, instead of refusing suspense, may recalibrate it in especially peculiar and fascinating ways. As I have noted, ingrained definitions of cinematic suspense are largely concerned with narrative eventuation, our purely psychological attachment to characters by means of point of view structures, and our calculation of plot probabilities. I suspect that most film scholars, if asked to define suspense, would cite the distinction between suspense and surprise made famous by Alfred Hitchcock. Suspense entails forewarning for the spectator and puts us ahead of the characters in terms of knowledge, building tension and concern as we wait powerlessly for their fate to be decided. Whereas surprise is a sudden turn of events, like a bolt of lightning, without a gradual buildup and periods of delay. This familiar understanding of suspense is linked to another demarcation, one that distinguishes the suspense thriller genre, which turns on our psychological identification with ordinary protagonists thrust into danger, from the whodunit murder mystery, a more cerebral, less emotional exercise of problem solving in relation to the plot. This branding of suspense as a genre unto itself, a taxonomic view that surfaced in the 1940s across the media of literature, radio, theater, and film, is still very much with us. It creates confusion as to whether suspense is best considered as a genre, a more fluid aesthetic mode that can be found throughout multiple genres, or a state of anxious uncertainty that resides in the spectator as a matter of experience, regardless of genre. What the generic pigeonholing of suspense conceals is that suspense encompasses all these aesthetic and experiential dimensions. Like hypnosis, suspense refers both to a technical process and to the experiential state elicited, spanning the interface between them. It is a conceptual couplet in that it intertwines formal design and spectatorial feeling. Far from simply comprising its own genre, it extends over multiple genres, in some cases thriving where critical and commercial labels have trained us not to identify it. Another widespread critical tendency that needs to be rethought is the neat association of cinematic suspense with accelerated pacing. Julian Honeck, in a study of chases and countdown sequences, differentiates suspense from dread on the basis of speed. Dread, he argues, quote, is almost unmoving, quiet, and slow. Suspense is hectic, loud, and fast, unquote. Such rapidly paced sequences, which have evolved from the cross-cutting schemes of early cinema, enjoy a prominent place in the history of screen suspense, but they represent one gear among others. I will later approach dread as a subset of suspense that reduces or totally effaces any cause for optimism regarding the narrative outcome in the balance. The point to be stressed here is that no essential difference in terms of velocity defines suspense. Nothing about the word denotes rapidity, loudness, or frenetic energy. In fact, the legal contexts in its etymology refer to the slow, static prolongation of an unresolved issue, a frustratingly not fast circumstance. What we need is a working conception of suspense receptive to the fact that it can materialize on a wide dynamic range of intensities, from swift to slow in terms of rhythm, and from profuse to scarce in terms of affective stimuli. Raymond Dugnat, in a revisitation of Hitchcock's Psycho, laments how critics and academics frequently fail to understand that suspense comes in many kinds. As he puts it, low-key ominous or climactic nail-biting, pursuit adrenaline or haunted house creep with any moment jump out foreboding, and so on, unquote. As part of his comparison of Psycho to Michelangelo Antonioni's art film of the same year, L'Avventura, he advises the use of a broad scale of intensities for defining suspense and offers a numerical gradient. And you can see that on the screen here from 10 down to 4 and below. Instructive for my purposes, Dugnat detects low-key and diffuse suspense in both Psycho and L'Avventura in stretches of downtime where the plot's momentum slackens or vanishes. And a more lyrical, as he puts it, a lyrical atmosphere-driven logic comes forward to govern the sonic and visual events, a lulling, ostensibly dull Stimmung, his word, that nevertheless augments our sensitivity to minor details and minimalist moves of style, without doing away with the baseline of anxiety that ongoingly imbues our experience. This analysis begs us to consider how suspense can awaken and shape attention tangentially to the narrative, how it may deliver aesthetic payoffs for which the plot is mere pretext. Dugnat's description of subtle, primarily atmospheric suspense and intervals of narrative suspension calls out to be applied to contemporary slow art house cinema, especially examples that flirt with thriller, horror, and melodrama, while not quite making good on the mainstream promises of those genres. One thinks of all of these films listed here. I won't read their names, but these are certainly films that are straddling that boundary between art cinema and popular cinema to some extent. Even where playful flirtation with a popular genre is absent or minimal at best, slow cinema directors such as Chantal Ackerman, Pichutpong Weerasethakul, and Pedro Costa can be said to restyle suspense somewhere between nil, diffuse, and ominous along Dugnat's gradient. Adrian Martin distills something of this minimalist reinvention of suspense in his review of Gus Van Sant's Elephant, a slow-moving, temporally distended film that recreates the Columbine High School massacre. Noting its, quote, growing atmosphere of low-level and eventually high-level anxiety, unquote, Martin discerns how suspense emerges from the slightest formal operations, including but not limited to the mobile long take. As Martin puts it, Van Sant is exploiting in a masterful way one of the most basic and powerful properties of cinema as a medium. Cinema not only gives us things to see, it plays on our mounting desire for this spectacle to at last deliver itself to us. One consequence of this is that when we talk about things like suspense or tension in movies, we do not have to be talking about a specific personalized hero in danger or a central fictional conflict. Suspense and tension can come purely from the movement of a camera, the rising arc of a sound, a gradual change in the color palette of the screen, the choreography of a body, unquote. I will circle back to this form-centered apprehension of slow cinema's power to bring on atmospheric suspense. But first, my sense of atmospheric suspense needs to be better explained as it figures in a larger morphology of suspense that includes but goes beyond purely narrative, generic, and character-based concerns. Suspense, at heart, names the anxious experience of enforced waiting before events over which we have little to no sway. It comes in many forms that may, within a single film, overlap, correlate, or function at odds with one another. These forms are not cleanly delimited types so much as intersecting levels, and their combinations may vary depending on the film's aesthetic priorities. Indeed, one of the major drawbacks of prevailing theories of suspense, such as Noel Carroll's, is that they don't recognize how much suspense has changed since its classical Hollywood constitution, how it has evolved internationally along intersecting pathways within and outside the mainstream. Each of the forms I mention is more intricate than I have the space to demonstrate here. I am mainly invested in atmospheric suspense as it combines with, and in some cases supersedes, its neighboring forms. Plot-based suspense is, of course, the most familiar variety. We wonder where the film's narrative is headed next and what will befall the characters, although, as Dragnot's invocation of L'Avventura has already made clear, a film's elicitation of suspense may flourish where the plot threads are put on hold. In much of slow cinema, the very incipience of plot may be suspenseful as we wait for the basic orienting threads to fall into place, if this ever quite occurs. Character-based suspense is equally familiar. Many definitions of suspense in general hinge on our identification with characters, typically, though not always, the protagonist. But many suspense strategies openly frustrate that mechanism. The sustained suppression of character identity and information can incite a more deeply unresolved suspense. Screen figures in slow cinema tend not to convey characterological depth. Their flattened affect and muted gestures often fall in line with the traditions of the Bressonian model, the neo-realist non-professional, or still more elusive registers of embodiment, such as the weary, dispossessed non-agents Elena Gorfinkel has examined. Suspense in Chantal Ackerman's La Captive results from the concerted blockage of identification where the inaccessible and ultimately unknowable Ariane is concerned. Do we ever identify with the impassive surface that is the lead character in Lucretia Martel's The Headless Woman, or with the adrift, liminal being that is the police detective in Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Charisma? Most descriptions of suspense in cinema stop after plot and character, disregarding the no less significant structural, perceptual, and atmospheric levels of the films. What I call structural suspense develops when we find ourselves anxiously pressed to keep track of and sort out not merely epistemic issues of plot, but a governing logic of presentation, an unfolding process at the level of style and structure. In structural suspense, the film urges us to contemplate the basis for mysterious formal patterns that repeat with variations across multiple segments, sometimes in excess of or tangential to the narrative. Think of the systems of doubling and thrillers of every stripe. Or think of the process-oriented structures in minimalist filmmaking from Bresson and Melville to Ackerman that build suspense around the very modus of presentation. In an off-sided passage, Roland Barthes defines suspense as a game with structure that arouses pleasure in the anxiety regarding the possibility of an infinitely open and unresolved sequence. Hitchcockian games with structure sadistically play on our rising concern that we might miss something crucial to the emergent pattern. Take the frantic zooms, focus pulls, lap dissolves, and whirling camera work in Don't Look Now, as well as the relays of red across the mise-en-scène, which excessively tease us with the prospect of an omen. After Hours plays a similar game of hyperbolic suspense, as Leslie Stern puts it, through misleading punctuations in its manic style. The referent for this suspense, writes Stern, is nothing other than anxiety itself. Instead of simply comprising a genre unto itself, suspense may arise from a tentative and possibly misleading invocation of genres on the part of films. There is generic suspense when the status of a genre is made ambiguous or mercurial, making us uncertain about whether a genre is operative at all. We may also feel an apprehensive uncertainty over the degree to which a genre is operative. Will a certain genre that we faintly intuit become dominant to the point of dictating the film's narrative and affective profile? As we watch the opening third of Bacurau, suspense gathers in part around the question of what the odd thriller accents and the exploitation grade Western and science fiction elements are doing in the film, and whether they will become more ascendant. Madi Diop's Atlantics begins as a class-conscious coming-of-age drama / romance set against a realist backdrop of labor exploitation in Senegal, but little by little it morphs into an atmospheric zombie movie about spirit possession. We puzzle over this gently wrought shift and its peculiar tonal qualities as the film hovers above the generic expectations it may invite. Because the rhetoric around slow cinema has placed it so emphatically against mainstream filmmaking, its hybridizations with popular genres have been overlooked. As our study of pacifiction will attest, generic suspense often flourishes where slow cinema drifts beyond its art house categorical precincts. Perceptual suspense, my next level here, refers to when a film triggers anxious uncertainty by obfuscating our ability to discern the on-screen world, be it visually or orally. Pascal Bonitzer, from his essays on deframing and off-screen space to his studies of the labyrinth and partial vision, has made pioneering inroads into this form of suspense. Think of the inky darkness and eerie silence in Jacques Tourneur's films, designed to dovetail with the dark and quiet space of the film theater itself. Alejandro Amenabar's horror films, Thesis and the others, exquisitely bring about low-threshold perceptual suspense through the slightest ambient noises around characters in cramped frames that are menaced by off-screen ambiguities. In obstructing and starving the senses, this form of stoking anxiety activates an archaic meaning of the word suspense lost in today's cultural uses, that of deprivation. As a slow art house film crossed with the thriller Stranger by the Lake radically reduces its sensory stimuli in dilated moments that magnify our attention to the merest hint of potential danger. In its nocturnal finale, as our protagonist seeks refuge in a lakeside forest from his serial-killing romantic partner, the visual field is engulfed by pitch darkness, and the scene, now defined mainly by the sounds of insects and the character's breath, hovers between ominous and serene tones. The scene subtly puts in place what Davina Quinlivan calls a locus of breath between screen and viewer, insofar as our own faintly audible breathing coincides and coalesces with the characters. If we feel psychological alignment, it slowly gives way to a different affective relationship to the film's world, a qualitative something more at the level of embodied receptivity. This notion of a qualitative something more brings us finally to atmospheric suspense, with which the perceptual variety often conspires. In atmospheric suspense, we are, as spectators, enfolded and gripped by the spatially emanative expression of the film's world, an affective and environmental condition that depends on operations of style. Robert Spadoni has illustrated how atmosphere is everywhere styled, and how all the stylistic resources at the filmmaker's disposal, from framing and camera work to sound, music, color, editing rhythms, and mise-en-scène, may have a shaping and texturing role when they holistically combine. Spadoni's close attention to style enables him to ground atmosphere as he delineates it as an aesthetic weather system, referring not only to literal renderings of weather, but to the variable stylistic process in and through which a film instills its spaces with emotionality, as Spadoni puts it. Writing about horror films of the 1930s and 40s, Spadoni also acknowledges that eerie and suspenseful atmospherics can be as potent in diminution as in abundance. They can powerfully, quote, gather and thicken in the spaces opened up by sparse storytelling. In the domain of film atmosphere, workings of style transmit and in fact are forces of mediation. In Jean Epstein's The Fall of the House of Usher, what is atmospheric is not just, for example, the fog that sweeps across a field, the sunlight that reflects on a rippling lake, or the wind that moves through the bare tree limbs outside the Usher Manor. These profilmic objects and events become atmospheric by undergoing qualitative amplifications through their cinematic treatment, taking on moods and sensations as added values. Film style inextricably is part of the atmospheres it articulates. In Epstein's adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's Gothic short story, camera movement, superimpositions, focus pulls, slow motion, and intercutting collectively render delicate, filmy atmospheric textures that uncannily fuse with the diaphanous materials and phenomena pictured in the mise en scène. The optical devices are not given to feel like ornamental markings upon the diegesis at some remove. Instead, they feel like endogenous expressions and tracings of animate forces astir within the diegesis, forces that somehow interweave the inside of the in ruins manor with the external surroundings and with the psychological interiority of the ailing, hypersensitive Roderick. Suspense of an atmospheric kind, colors are not knowing the logic of these felt yet elusive interrelations. For reasons I am just beginning to elaborate, the atmospheric qualities of cinema demand that we account for both Gnostic and Pathic dimensions of suspense, to borrow terms from Erwin Strauss's The Primary World of Senses, his 1963 treatise. Gnostic aspects are those that pertain to knowledge, as well as to a hermeneutic practice whereby sensory experience at a distance passes into the understanding of things and events as they become objects of our apperception. That is, as we assimilate them to the general body of ideas we already have. Pathic dimensions, however, have to do with our sensing and intimate contact with the world. In the case of film suspense, there are pathic operations that take hold of us before and that may have priority over Gnostic concerns of story. Atmospheric suspense then involves a pathic firstness of sensation that works on our nervous system before, during, and possibly in excess of narrative, though we might not be mindful of its effects until afterwards. And this is how atmospheric suspense may rearrange the temporal structure of suspense. Instead of always directing us towards some future narrative result, it prompts us to wonder about the affective forces that have already gripped us in prior moments without our awareness, and that continue to hold us in their clutches, leading us to feel suspense is happening right now. In encountering Kiyoshi Kurosawa's slow unfurling detective thriller / horror film Cure, we are, from the opening seconds, atmospherically claimed by clandestine powers of hypnotic suggestion in the diegesis and in the film's sensory address. Low-level stimuli, from sounds and images of water to pulsing lights, through to mobile camera work and eccentric cutting rhythms. This circumstance, namely our implied share in the entrancement, is afoot well before we start to realize it, before our Gnostic grasp of narrative causality catches up with the film's cumulative pathic influence on us. A languid political thriller that concerns the specter of nuclear annihilation in present-day Tahiti, the economic, cultural, and political center of the French Polynesian Islands, Pacifiction departs somewhat from the stylistic profile that, for many critics, cemented a slow cinema canon in the early 2000s. This international group style, which included Serra's earlier works, such as Honor of the Nights and Birdsong, tended toward the extraordinarily long take amid scenes of quietude, stasis, or banality. With Pacifiction, Sarah less frequently enlists extended takes, while still imparting, over the 162 minutes of the film, a viscous and hypnotic impression of slow time. Slow pace and rhythm aren't limited to shot duration. Pacifiction is slow, as in hesitant, to disclose and develop its plot as we wait for basic story elements to fall into place. The thinly drawn narrative follows Duroler, played by Benoit Mazimel, the charming, ideologically dubious French High Commissioner and representative of French state affairs in Polynesia. Sporting blue-tinted sunglasses and an unflappable white linen suit, he maneuvers from one behind-the-scenes discussion to another, inquiring into rumors of resumed nuclear testing on the island, a replay of traumatic history in that France detonated nearly 200 nuclear weapons in the area in the late 1960s and 70s, which poisoned the environment and locals with radiation. The film presents itself as a genre hybrid, partly with its nightclub scenes that emulate film noir's public milieu of corruption, loss, and liminality. And here I'm thinking specifically of Vivian Sobchak's wonderful essay on lounge time in film noir. One also thinks of the noir-inflected nightclub atmospheres in Adam Agoyan's Exotica and Claire Denis' Beau Travail. Further, the film summons, in its visual style, use of architecture, and paranoid mood, the conspiracy thrillers directed by Alan J. Pakula in collaboration with cinematographer Gordon Willis, in particular Clute and The Parallax View. Nicholas Rapold aptly summates Pacifiction as, quote, a feature-length version of the shot of the boat in the parallax view before it explodes, before you know anything for sure, unquote. Not unlike the boat scene in Pakula's film, where witness to a political assassination meets in private, so he thinks, with a journalist, Pacifiction builds suspense by indefinitely blending or tottering between senses of wariness, a lulling reprieve, and a widening paranoia that increasingly seems justified. As further references for this mixed world feeling, as Daniel Yakovone would put it, Sarah names The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, Cutter's Way, and The Ghost Rider. Uncertainties of plot gradually arise. Are the naval military unit and arrogant captain who have come to Tahiti indeed planning to set off a nuclear device, perhaps from a submarine under the waves? Are the vaguely American businessman and attaché whose passport has gone missing at the hotel somehow in cahoots with the nuclear testing? And are they also sponsoring, likely in bad faith, an indigenous resistance effort? Will de Roller get to the bottom of these intrigues and in the process keep his position of authority as he also deals with economic and cultural tensions surrounding a casino in the works? These questions are compounded by generic suspense that follows from Pacifiction's hybridity and elusiveness. To what extent will the film deliver as a conspiracy thriller, dramatically, politically? Generic suspense here partners with atmospheric suspense, given that the generically fraught nods to other films are largely about look and feel. The patina of Pacifiction cinematography, rendered using cost-efficient digital Blackmagic 4K pocket cameras fitted with 16mm zoom lenses, is oddly radiant and hazy, yet selectively sharp at the same time, with supersaturated color values that skew toward neon pink and blue with occasional purple. At times, this artificial light is concretely sourced in the mise-en-scène, attributed to the decor of a club, and sometimes it isn't. This cinematographic patina, as I'm calling it, dreamily channels Michael Mann's work, from the beach scenes in Manhunter to the landscapes and colors in the tropical crime thriller Miami Vice, a key atmospheric reference Sarah confirms. Viewed in this way, Atmospheres can be intertextual, reaching past the single film in front of us, or, to word it better, such generic and atmospheric suspense is intertextural when it elusively opens onto resonances with other film worlds along the lines of shared sensorial characteristics. Showcasing its look and feel no less intensely than it does the acting prowess of Mazimel as de Roller, who emits his share of atmospheric energy. Pacifiction offsets its dialogue scenes with a series of hypnotic, progressively more unnerving tableaux that limit verbal expression and put a heavy emphasis on the physical environment. In these moments, which flirt with cliches of postcard exoticism while also disrupting such imagery with eerie sonic drones, plot-driven suspense is stalled, not to say canceled out, as the atmospheric suspense thickens and becomes paramount. These scenes often situate de Roller at the precarious liminal edges of architectural structures and scaffoldings, his figure diminished in scale, reflected in panels of glass, drawn into thick shadow, or eclipsed by the landscape as he looks out at the ocean against a neon sunset that, despite being gorgeous, feels apocalyptic. If these shots of the surroundings tap into de Roller's paranoia, they also hint at nuclear radioactivity, be it from the past or the future, and imbue the film's world with dread, beyond any character's point of view. But looking and being looked at remain matters of concern. Some of these scenes call forward the theme, a la Orson Welles' Mr. Arkadin, of ubiquitous surveillance on a vast grid of geopolitical intrigue that finds no clear and objectifiable representation in the film. In these intervals of atmospheric uneasiness, sound matters immeasurably. The electronic score, composed by Sarah's longtime collaborators, Mark Vertiger and Joe Robinson, assumes an important expressive role where the binary distinction between diegetic and non-diegetic sound loses its validity. With its low frequency, reverberant disturbances, it is less music than a sonic mediational force that oscillates between associations with the churning sea, the droning motors of boats and aircraft, and the pulsing sonar tone of a submarine. By seeming to have an endogenous, ambient presence within the diegesis, it bears out Stefan Wien's point that sound isn't an accompaniment to a preformed visual depiction of the diegesis, but instead a founding element of the diegetic world. Moreover, the score brings atmospheric suspense into intimate convergence with perceptual suspense, in that its source is obscure and unstable at best, even as the sonic field enwraps us and rumbles in our bones. The score implies the influence of a larger web of conspiracy we cannot identify, though we, along with de Roller, are anxiously aware of its possible reaches. Structural suspense becomes a factor too, given that the repetition of aural murmurs across these scenes of narrative deferral forms an ominous pattern we are prompted to trace, wondering if the sounds amount to clues. There is an aesthetic logic of accumulation by which suspense develops atmospherically, perceptually, and structurally across this series of tableaux, leading up to a surreal late-night set piece that transpires at a soccer field. Film atmosphere, let us not forget, is as much temporal as spatial. It has synchronic and diachronic effects that aren't necessarily in step with an advancing plot line. Where suspense is concerned, the nextness of plot isn't the same thing as the moreness of atmosphere. It's multi-scenic accretion. It takes time, of course, for a film's atmosphere to set in, cross the distance of mediation, and make its mark. Though it strikes us first, we are always suspended between catching up with its influence belatedly, tuning into its present modulations, and anticipating its later contours. Yet we improve as we go, as the film trains us in the nuances of atmosphere-conscious attention. Instructive here is Jacobon's account of the cumulative and holistic expression of film worlds, how, as immersed viewers, we gradually become acclimated to an atmospheric world sensed as a whole. The soccer field scene near the end of Pacifiction absorbs and distills the film's preceding accrual of atmospheric suspense. The scene stages the slow, furtive conjunction of de Roulaire and the presumably American industrialist around the modest sports complex. The intercutting shows them slink out from the shadows to sounds of wind and insects, just as the field's halogen lights power on by their own volition. The scene is timed to the approach of a rainstorm, as well as to the reemergence of the ambient score, which again imitates a sonar ping, while also reinforcing the imminent buzz of the lights. Little by little, the score slides into more abstract distortions, at one point sounding like the snarl of an unseen animal, as de Roulaire walks out onto the vibrantly green pitch, surveys the area, and raises his hands and face in a gesture of surrender, opening his mouth to take in the mist. He interacts with the atmosphere instead of the businessman, who now watches on from an absurdly close position. Indeed, the cloak and dagger premise of the scene is somewhat ridiculous, even as its style gives off an entrancing atmospheric quality. The interplay of close-ups and wide shots makes it impossible for us to glean an exact geometry of gazes and bodies, and the men seem to be merely playing at espionage in a randomly selected location that has no bearing on the plot. Like the anticlimactic warehouse confrontation in The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, we have a standoff scene wherein no real standoff occurs, and the characters are reduced to the inanity of their misplaced genre-coded gestures. At the same time, this partly comic tone coalesces with dread, in that the nuclear threat seems impossible to avert. Dread is a subset of suspense in which hope for a positive outcome is lost, and when the threat is profound. And there I'm drawing on Cynthia Freeland's conception of dread. The scene's emphasis on the facility's lights echoes the ending of Antonioni's Eclipse, where cinematographically flared street lights at a suburban park, in combination with a shot of a newspaper headline regarding the arms race, vaguely connote the possibility of thermonuclear disaster. This is another deliberate black screen. It would be easy and wrong to dismiss Pacifiction as a hollow exercise in style. Let us not fall back into the habit of thinking cinematic atmosphere achieves nothing beyond a kind of decorative, scenic beautification. One might regret Sarah's lack of a clear position regarding the colonial and neo-colonial histories at stake in the narrative. Yet nowhere does this film pretend to operate as a direct and didactic commentary on this subject, notwithstanding de Roulaire's partly inspired and partly fatuous monologue describing geopolitics as a dark nightclub, its rich and powerful players all totally removed from reality, all pretending to have control over deeply chaotic and mysterious processes that escape their knowledge. If Pacifiction mostly refuses to offer up clear meanings for our interpretive convenience, its atmospheric style communicates by exploring the very problem of the apprehension of conspiracy in a contemporary world where power relations are exceedingly abstruse. The film, in this way, rubs shoulders with the project of speculation that Frederick Jameson attributes to 1970s American conspiracy thrillers, which can only hypothesize as they take aim at an absent, unpresentable totality that nonetheless makes its presence felt spatially. Across Pacifiction's intermittent tableau, all of which, as we have seen, riff on the conspiracy thriller, liminal settings figure as possible nodes on a larger matrix of power and authority that withdraws from representation as such. For the viewer, the struggle to figure out and follow the cumulative atmospheric system of the film runs parallel to and is conflated with the impossibility of discerning the totality of conspiracy. In neither case do we come away quenched. The atmospheric suspense strands us somewhere between cliches of genre and the vague allegorization of the real world outside the film's diegesis, where covert corruption and looming catastrophe require little effort to envision. Okay, this is the last section, and I'll be concluding shortly. My atmospherically inclined analysis of passive fiction has called for a rethinking of how the aesthetic practice and experience of suspense are theorized in film scholarship. More than this, I hope to have made it clear that slowness in art house cinema needs to be treated less rigidly and isolatedly, in greater appreciation of its wide range of possible affects and emotions. Slowness in art cinema needs to be re-examined with an eye toward its hybridization with popular styles, and with allowances for a more anxious and fluctuating spectator response that doesn't necessarily slot into boredom on the one hand, or unperturbed wonderment on the other. Far from being an outlier, passive fiction is part of a larger slow cinema lineage in which atmospheric suspense plays an integral role. From the styles of pioneers like Antonioni, Ackerman, and Andrei Tarkovsky, through to contemporary torchbearers such as Ho Xiaoshen and Apichatpong. There are many different kinds of slow cinema, but the history and ongoing expansion of this canon includes several films that register somewhere on Dougnat's scale of suspense, if not always on the basis of plot, then at least in the morphological areas of atmospheric and perceptual suspense. Since film atmosphere emanates and envelops, gripping the spectator and texturing space, not just the virtual space presented by the fictional world, but the space of mediated contact that is our interface with the screen. The study of atmospheric suspense requires that we factor in the environmental conditions and dispositif of the exhibition space itself. Respective debates about slow cinema and film atmosphere have in common a rather concerted preference for theatrical viewing as the most advantageous dispositive structure. Large screen, loudspeakers, consuming darkness, and public audience. This traditional arrangement is said to be conducive to the full body effects of multisensory expression and to careful attention, albeit periodically drifting in the case of prolonged slowness and sparseness. I agree with this high estimation of the theatrical encounter, but I also want to acknowledge that my horizon of concerns, atmosphere, slowness, and suspense, at some point demands the consideration of other media technical dispositifs, namely those that have culturally displaced the theater as the primary means of film viewing. And my book goes into this in more detail than I can do it here by participating in the post-cinema debate. How, for example, is atmospheric perception altered by a shiny handheld touchscreen equipped with headphones? Is it not ahistorical to assume that immersive spectatorship has been unfazed by the technical transformations that have certainly changed our attentional habits and capacities? Are there not ways in which domestic or portable screen-based devices have strengthened the impact of film atmosphere? Saving these larger questions for another occasion, this is a deliberate black screen, I will wrap up here by addressing how slowness and suspense of an atmospheric order benefit from the theatrical environment. Some accounts of slow cinema have recently formed a loose consensus around the claim that moments of extreme duration amid uneventfulness on the screen prompt us to turn away from the image and take in the sensory affordances of the viewing space itself. Citing Roland Barthes' famous 1975 essay, Leaving the Movie Theater, Tiago De Luca and Carl Schoonover and Rosalind Galt have convincingly made this argument to similar political ends that have to do with the renunciation of the capitalistic labor of spectatorial attention in favor of a somatic relationship with other anonymous members of the audience. To be sure, certain slow films lend themselves to this transition and focus. DeLuca's primary example, Simon Liang's Goodbye Dragon Inn, enacts this shift in its depiction of theatrical viewing, or not viewing. That said, when we consider the enveloping reaches of film atmosphere, rather than just the images on the screen, and when we analyze a low-key suspenseful film like Pacifiction, and I would contend Goodbye Dragon Inn is also such a film, then our portrait of spectatorship becomes more delicately multifaceted. No doubt Bart's Leaving the Movie Theater essay is germane on this score, but it ventures a more complex account of spectator experience. His reflection isn't about boredom. Written as a light riposte to the paranoia of 1970s apparatus theorists, for whom the theatrical film dispositif was a kind of subjugation chamber, the essay reappropriates the maligned concept of cinema as hypnosis through his self-referential notion of the double-bodied viewer. Bart defines himself as an observer attached to the image and distanced from it at the same time. A dual spectator whose fixation on the screen is complicated by an equally hypnotic, yet perverse, pull toward, quote, the texture of the sound, the hall, the darkness, the obscure mass of the other bodies, the rays of light, unquote. In personally espousing this manner of, quote, letting oneself be fascinated twice over by the image and by its surroundings, unquote, Bart doesn't sever the one spectatorial body from the other. He doesn't imply an absolute once and for all turning of attention away from the screen, but rather a mutable, more or less concurrent dynamic of spectatorship, a compound state of pleasurable fascination derived from two, albeit competing and differently inflected sources. My assertion is that within the communal darkness in which a slow film like Pacifiction is received, even when we redirect our attention onto the viewing situation itself, we remain swathed by a bodily felt atmosphere of suspense that circulates between the film's world and the setting of our encounter. The theater becomes, as phenomenological philosopher Michael Dufresne would say, the tentacular extension of the aesthetic world. For instance, when Apichatpong's Memoria, as part of its aesthetic suspense, visually and sonically evokes the theatrical situation to which its release pattern in the US confined itself, doing so with the cracking of chairs and its dark, cave-like environments on screen, an ambient play of sensation addresses both orientations of the dual, doubly fascinated spectator of whom Bart writes. Equally intent on harnessing the benefits of the theatrical dispositif, Serra's Pacifiction is emblematic of the unrushed, atmosphere-driven style of suspense I have explored. The film's exemplary nature reaches beyond its invocations of the paranoid thriller and beyond the fact its plot situations and sensory cues gradually instill anxious uncertainty in the spectator. Pacifiction invites us to contemplate and savor the fundamentally suspenseful qualities of cinematic atmosphere itself, apprehended as an emanative, spreading, encircling, and yet mysteriously indefinite affective force of mediation that cannot be contained by the frame or the screen. The film induces and sustains suspense in large measure by forcing us to feel before and in excess of our cognitive evaluative activity as viewers the alluring and disquieting ambiguities of its atmospheric system. It offers a striking case in point for how the felt nowness and accretion of atmospheric suspense may override our Gnostic concerns with the nextness of plot. Granted, the plot and our protagonist's paranoia are crucial filters in our encounter, but we also find ourselves anxiously in the grip of atmospheric stimuli that do not hinge on our alignment with a character. Far from being just a vicarious or otherwise secondhand relational dynamic, suspense at this level entails our direct experience of a mediated world. Suspense of an embodied kind intensifies around the very process whereby the film's world is diffused spatially and affectively into our arena of perception, enhanced by the theatrical viewing environment as well as by the film's imposition of slow time. This experience allows for the spectator to drift between immersion and detachment, our attention drawn in part to the dispositive conditions on our side of the screen, conditions that become imbued with and factored into the atmosphere's aesthetic reach. Okay, thank you.
All right, so marvelous a talk, delivered by Dr. Warner, and so actually, I prepared 3 questions and comments, but I'm happy to reserve the second, which is related to the shifting post-cinematic condition of the cinema dispositive and its impact on suspense and slowness, that is characterized by the insistence on the traditional immersive movie theater and the migration of the cinematic styles and narratives into new screens, environments, and platforms, including the gallery. But your the last section of the talk is sufficient to answer my query like this. So let me to jump into the first question that I prepared. Actually, one of the things that I love most in this book is that your revised take of suspense as going beyond the character and plot and a particular set of popular film genres is inspired by several renowned film critics we are familiar with, such as Shigeki Hasumi and Adrian Martin. For instance, you start with Hasumi's view of suspense as the viewer's, quote, anxious, derated time of waiting on the threshold between nothingness and eventfulness, end quote, in the case of Pedro Costa's Osos, and with Adrian's perceptive note on Gus Van Sant Elephant. Then you extend those critics' insights along with what so-called slow cinema prepares and implies into the series of film style and film spectatorship, and eventually into what you call the atmospheric turn of film theory, through which the experience of suspense is viewed as tonal and sensuous, in as much as it is created by a film's visual, sonic, material, and technical and binary intertextual aspects that disrupt the viewer's immediate identification and meaning making. So I was wondering how you come up with, and develop this revisionist and elastic direction or methodologies that lead to making productive correspondence between suspense, slowness, and atmosphere, and a kind of ideal marriage of film theory and film criticism.
Right, thank you for that question. So, yeah, when I was approaching this, and let me say, when I first started work on this project, I thought it was going to be a book about slow cinema more generally. And then I realized that the films that I most wanted to write about operated somewhere between slow cinema and popular cinema. And I noticed that even as some of those films were being discussed by critics and scholars, that no one was talking about suspense at all. No one was talking about anxiety and negative affects that I feel quite often when I'm watching slow films. And so, it was really a sort of eureka moment for me when I found film critics like Asumi, like Adrian Martin, who were observing the kind of suspense that I wanted to identify. And what Martin says in his reading of Elephant is actually very close to how Chantal Ackerman talked about suspense, that it can arise just from the subtlety, like the subtle change of a camera going from static to mobile. But to get started on this project, I was really drawing probably more from film criticism than I was film theory. And it sort of seemed to me like maybe it's just our training as film scholars, but we're sort of taught to eradicate suspense by explaining the film, plugging it into a theoretical framework that we front load. And so then the film kind of like forcibly has to be the perfect case study for the framework that we've introduced. And that very way of approaching a film, of course, kills suspense, right? So for me, like one of the challenges was how can I write about suspense while letting suspense be itself? And, how can I avoid the temptation to explain it away? And so it seemed to me like critics were doing that better than film theorists were. Uh, yeah.
All right, so thank you. And could you stop, sharing your screen so that, the audiences are able to see,
Yes.
our faces more closely? And
Yes.
so, okay, great. And the last question I prepared for, this particular context is that in the book, you describe, occasionally several notable contemporary Korean films which either rehabilitate the traditional modern art cinema or cross its boundaries with popular cinema in terms of your taxonomy of the expanded theory of suspense. So you attend to, Hong Sang-soo's Right Now, Wrong Then as a film that attests to a minimalist variation of structural suspense along with Apichapong. And you also characterize Bong Joon-ho's Parasite as exemplary of the generic suspense marked by the gradual shift from comedy, melodrama to thriller horror. And you also take up Lee Chang-dong's Burning as creating atmospheric suspense in that it effectively blends quiet spaces and prosaic events with vague signs of mystery. So could you elaborate on how the films generate those different registers of suspense for this audience, whose majority are Korean cinephiles and students interested in film theory and criticism?
Right. Yes. Thank you for that question. So I'll start with um, Hong Sang-soo and structural suspense. You know, um, there were many filmmakers I was thinking about when I articulated my notion of structural suspense. Um, and a number of them were East Asian. I was also thinking about Ozu's films because, in David Bordwell's book on Ozu, he writes about this kind of game with form and structure that's happening in terms of sometimes like very minute repetitions that are happening. And so there's a little game with the viewer that's unfolding there. And no doubt, like those games with repetition and subtlety are happening in Hong Sang-soo's work, right? So I didn't write about those films, but I was certainly thinking about them. And right now, Wrong Then is one of the films that I had in mind. Um,
One of my his favorite too.
yeah, it's one of my favorites too. I feel like I can't keep up with his productivity. There's like a dozen of his films that I haven't seen in part because of how prolific he is. Uh, but I think that I had the idea for generic suspense, as I'm calling it, maybe while I was watching Parasite when I saw it the first time. Because yes, it presents itself to us initially as a kind of family melodrama, light comedy, and it just, piece by piece morphs into something closer to horror. Um, and I think what's interesting about that is it's not just that there is the slippage from one genre to another, but as you're sitting there and you're watching it, we're asking ourselves questions about the very status of genre, you know. And for me, that was exciting to experience. Burning is a film that I've written about in an article elsewhere, and it's a film that I really admire. I teach it a whole lot. My students love it also. Um, and I think Burning is such a great example of how uh, atmosphere can be really forceful and potent, even when we're talking about a minimalist kind of aesthetic. I think when we hear the word atmosphere, we tend to think of things like German expressionism or, like film noir. We tend to think of aesthetic systems that are more like in our face and overblown in terms of the stimuli that we're getting. But I think Burning is such a great example of how atmospheric suspense can intensify when you go the other way, like when you dial back and you pare things down. Um, and that is another film where there's generic suspense happening, actually, because it starts as a kind of realist sort of film, and then it gradually morphs into a thriller of sorts that's lined with dread, and that feeling of dread just like slowly creeps up on you. So what I'm saying in this talk about how atmosphere affects us initially before we even realize it, and by the time that we cognitively catch up with it, we've already been, impacted by its grip. And I think Burning is another example of that for sure. Um,
Yeah, thank you. So now we're gonna open, the floor for your questions, comments, or discussions. So anyone who wants say comment or question on Rick's in the talk, turn your microphone and video and say something, or you write something on the chat box on the right side of your screen, and um, so we receive it and let him respond to your question or comment. Oh. All right. Yeah. So all right. So let me read a question raised by Dr. Chan Yong-bu. So thanks for this fascinating talk. I wanted to ask about the place of politics in your book. In other words, oh, okay. So he now he
Could I
now?
ask
Yeah.
directly? Okay, great. So yeah, Professor Warner, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and I really enjoyed your book too. So um, I wanted to ask a question about, I mean, it's already written in the chat, the place of the politics in your book. I mean, I do see that like you're suggesting the possibility of making social commentary as shown in the reading of Pacifiction, but I also wonder if it rather leads to rather like the utmost like hardcore pursuit of pure form than the pursuit of like totality in Jameson's sense. And I also must admit that my question fundamentally comes from the overlap I noticed between your definition of this atmospheric suspense and the scholarship of melodrama, whereas the latter still tends to emphasize more on its political usage, either in more like a political instrumentalization of melodrama or questioning the very gendered usage of melodrama. So I wanted to just compare these two major scholarship in your framework. Thank you.
okay, right. So politics in one form or another comes up several times in my suspense book in ways that I didn't even plan on necessarily. Like the films took me there. Uh, I noticed, for instance, in films like Memoria or Zama, How or Pedro Costa's Horse Money. These are films that are all dealing with very charged political situations, uh, often in a historical context that's marked by trauma. Um, and yet the films don't deal with those issues directly at all, you know? And I think that one way of responding to that, and I guess we could group Pacifiction in with those other films. One way of responding to that is that the films are irresponsible because they're dealing with these charged political contexts, but they don't make it clear what they have to say about them. I remember reading a review of Memoria, Pong's film, and for those of you who've seen it, it like builds up to this scene where the Tilda Swinton character and a medium who's basically an extraterrestrial being, like they grip hands and they both kind of experience this memory of all manner of quotidian and traumatic events that have happened in the past in that particular location. We don't have access to any of that. It's happening more like within their subjectivities. And I remember reading a review of that film where the critic said, it's too bad that the film doesn't take the hand of the spectator, because like we end up not having access to that. And what I sort of gradually came to embrace as I was writing this book is suspense can actually be important when we're talking about the politics of a film, even if it means the film withholding certain things or suppressing certain things. Especially in the world that we have now, we all have this desire to know everything we need to know, and we want to know it right now, and we want to make our mind up about it immediately. I think a lot of my students, the moment they experience any sort of confusion about something, they want to pause the film and read the Wikipedia page or go watch a YouTube video that explains the film, so there's this like hastiness where we want to know everything. And I think that there's something actually very valuable about suspense, even the kind of atmospheric suspense. It's not just like art cinema ambiguity for its own sake. It's actually, being careful about the political context that it brings in. So, for instance, like in Pedro Costa's Horse Money, we actually don't know a whole lot about the characters that are featured in that film. And Costa admits that there's a lot in that film that comes from their participation, and he doesn't even know what it means. So, as I was writing about Horse Money, I was thinking about Glissant's notion of opacity. It's this like respect for the radical alterity of the other, and it's this suspension of our arguably like violent imposition of the need to know everything, So again, like to me, there's something valuable, even politically, about suspense when it pushes knowledge into check a little bit. So that is how I was thinking about the intersection of aesthetics and politics in the suspense book.
Yeah, now I get why you use the word epistemological in describing that approach that in your book. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
All right, so let me receive, further other, questions or comments, either, on the video or on the chat box. Actually, Chanyoung's question also relates to, another set of questions that I had in mind, actually, because, I've been thinking about what kind of factors, particularly at play, or what kind of factors enable many filmmakers across the globe to delve into the aesthetics of atmospheric suspense. And one factor I consider as important is kind of shifting ontological and epistemological condition that includes, the growing awareness of the contemporary world in crisis, precarity, and unfathomability. So the recent attention to the idea of steamium or atmosphere has, as has much to do with, the growing, scholarship of, eco cinema, or, the relationship cinema between cinema and Anthropocene. So I was wondering, so what kind of, your thought about, why, what other particular, conditions, enable, many filmmakers to, experiment with, the atmospheric suspense or slowness.
Right. Yes. So I didn't draw on this in my talk, but in the book I do draw in part on ecological notions of atmosphere and also perception. One book that I borrow from is Adrian Ivakhiev's book, I think Ecologies of the Moving Image.
Yeah.
And there he has a really fascinating notion of the firstness of atmosphere. I think he's implicitly drawing on Peirce,
Sure.
talking about firstness. Like narrative, in other words, would be secondness, but there's this like initial sort of, it's part of Ivakhiev's notion of perceptual ecology, that first there's this kind of atmosphere that grips us, initially. But, as part of this project, I saw that the turn to atmospheric suspense on the part of filmmakers was coming from a lot of different places. Some of it is ecological, but I also noticed, and I guess I wasn't surprised to see this, but a number of the films have in them a kind of nostalgia toward the theatrical viewing experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, Memoria is an overt example, or of course, Goodbye Dragon Inn. But there are several films beyond that, a dozen or more films that are clearly like just it's beyond nostalgia. It's like it's inviting a kind of viewing experience that depends on the specific dispositif of the theater. Um, so that was really interesting to see. And so even though I could say it's like a theoretical trend to start thinking about the environment, including the environment of the viewing space itself, it's not just scholars and academics who are thinking that way. The filmmakers are thinking that way too. Like the films are inviting us to consider the atmospheric environment of the theater itself. And I would also say, I don't say this in the talk, and I didn't say it in the book enough, but when you're watching a film with, a public audience and you're surrounded by mostly strangers, that's an atmospheric quality too, right? Like we all know from watching comedies or horror films, especially, that our viewing experience is informed and inflected by the vibe, more or less, that we're feeling from other people around us. Julian Honeck wrote an interesting book on this. I forget what it's called. I think The Audience Effect, maybe. And so, I'm trying to move beyond just like a strictly formalist account of atmosphere.
Right, thank you. Actually, there are more things to discuss, in particularly the status of the traditional cinema, and many, notable filmmakers, like I said, nostalgic, revisiting of the movie theater, its particular power and atmosphere, and the transformation of other extra, cinematic spaces into particular atmospheric or the spaces for revivifying, the cinematic, experiences, including the gallery. So we can see the coexistence of these two kinds of spaces as a notable, the characteristic of the post-cinematic condition that I definitely have much to say about, but but because of the time limit, so let us reserve the time for the next opportunity, personally or for the occasion. So thank you, Rick, for wonderful and rich and multifaceted, and texture and extra texture talk that invite us to think about very different, very integrated strands of concepts of film theory and criticism in relation to the shifting, condition of cinematic, image and experience. So thank you again,
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the questions. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me switch to Korean for informing you of the center's next event. 예, 센터의 다음 저기 그 여름 그 이벤트를 좀 알려드리겠습니다. 마치기 전에요. 저 서동민 조연 저 이미지 띄워주시고요. 예, 예. 예, 그 7월 저희 그 영화미디어학센터에서는 이제 그 뭐 여러 서머 이벤트들을 준비 중인데 행사들이요. 그 7월 4일에 저 밴더빌트 베이 김보영 선생님이 그 첫 번째 책이신 Critical Capitalist, The Spirit of Asset Capitalism in South Korea. 금년 1월에 미시간 유니버시티 프레스에서 출간된 책을 주제로 톡을 하실 거고 서강대 최서영 선생님께서 토론을 맡아주실 겁니다. 이 이벤트는 하이브리드로 진행합니다. 예, 7월 4일에 그 라이브 스트리밍으로 함께 하면서 이제 인퍼슨도 하고요. 예, 따로 저기 그 관련된 안내 드리도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 그 저희가 심혈을 기울여서 준비한 제1회 영화 미디어학 여름학교 시네마 미디어 스터디 서머 스쿨 예, 그 일정 강사진 프로그램이 6월 10일에 저희 소셜미디어 뉴스레터를 통해 공개가 될 예정이니까 많은 관심 부탁드리고 많이 입소문 내주십시오. 예, 그럼 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. So thank you for all your attention to today's event and to see you for the next event. So okay, Rick, have a good night, and we'll definitely keep on communicating with each other by email and on by others.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jahun.
Thank you.